go ahead into the chat and just say hi and tell us where you're calling into the webinar from. It's always good to see where everybody's coming from.
Yes, absolutely. And I just got the ball rolling there, so folks have an example.
Yeah, so if you caught that as you're coming in, here we go. Oh, Nancy Kishpaw, it's great to see you from Independence. Thanks for joining us, Nancy. Ed, coming in Eastbrook High School in Icard, North Carolina. Joe from Abingdon, Maryland. John Kelly from up in Tuscarawas County in Ohio, Economic Development.
John,
Excellent.
glad to see you were able to join us. Thanks so much. And that actually reminds me, for anyone who wasn't able to join us yesterday, there were some technical issues with scheduling, so less people were able to join than we had hoped. I have already sent out a follow-up email from yesterday's presentation, but I'll be including both today and yesterday's recordings in the follow-up after this presentation. So no worries there.
All right. I see we've had a few more folks coming in. So as you do, just please say hi to everyone and tell us where you're coming in from. We'll get started just here in a second.
And as we're going, as folks typically have seen on similar webinars, I'll be reading out the questions to Rob at a couple different scheduled times for questions in between the different parts of the presentation. If you do have a question throughout, please feel free to throw that in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll bring that up at the next possible moment or answer you via text if it's something I can handle.
Great. All right. Well, we're a few minutes in, so I guess, Nick, we probably should go ahead and get rolling. I know a few folks will be joining us after we get started.
Sounds good, Rob. Perfect.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to this second part of our two-part webinar on entrepreneurial mindset education. I'm Rob Herndon. I'm the president of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. And today I'm going to try and give you some ideas around how to take the lessons that we talked about yesterday in sort of the more theoretical portion of the webinar and see if you can start applying those, taking some of those ideas and giving you some ideas about how they can be applied to create entrepreneurial learning environments in practice. So it's sort of a theory and practice concept we have going on with these series of webinars. And if you haven't had a chance to see or participate in that one that was given yesterday, Nick will be providing that recording. It's fine. You'll be able to, get through this just fine. I'll make a few. I'll allude to that webinar in a few spots, but otherwise, you should be in good shape to follow along with everything that we're talking about today. And please, we want this to be interactive, so we will have a few spots, as Nick mentioned, where you can jump in and ask questions. Do those whenever you feel the need in the chat. Nick will try and answer some of those as he can through the text. And then if we need to, we can address those verbally when we take breaks to talk through these ideas. So we hope to get a good discussion going today around this concept of creating entrepreneurial learning environments. So let's talk a little bit about what our webinar is going to cover today after I give you an idea around what ELI is all about. So if you're not familiar with the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, we do essentially three things. We provide professional development specifically around the ideas around the entrepreneurial mindset. We do training in our programs in the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program that I'll talk a little bit about towards the end of the webinar today. And then we just do workshops with smaller groups, large groups, whoever you've got at different organizations, community organizations, colleges, universities, government, corporate, around these ideas to start interacting with the entrepreneurial mindset. And then, of course, we have our Ice House courseware that was developed through the support of the Kauffman Foundation that I'll be talking about at the end of this webinar today. So that's what we're all about. If you haven't had a chance to interact with us in the past, thanks for joining us today, and we hope we can solve whatever problem you have out there that potentially we could serve you. So, all right, let's go into what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to define what we mean by entrepreneurial learning. In our work, we've, through our interviews of the everyday entrepreneur, of those unlikely entrepreneurs, we have a good understanding of how entrepreneurs learn in the wild, in just how they operate in a sort of normal day-to-day fashion, and how they're picking up and learning things as they go. So I'm going to talk about 4 concepts around entrepreneurial learning that you can, take and apply those concepts into whatever it is that you're doing. You'll see that these concepts apply across the board, and that's why we do work in such a wide-ranging spheres, whether it's education or government, corporate, etc. And then we'll take a break after we talk about that entrepreneurial learning to answer any questions, and then I'll go into the 8 core competencies that make up sort of the core essence of the entrepreneurial mindset. These start getting to a little bit more detail in ideas and concepts that you can work through in, as you're trying to get more of an entrepreneurial mindset, or you're trying to teach others how to think like an entrepreneur. So we'll talk about those 8 core competencies and then have some questions around that as well. Then we'll talk more about what we call our opportunity discovery process, and what opportunity discovery is really all about. If you did happen to catch the webinar yesterday, you would have heard Gary describe the transformation theory of Dr. George Land, and how that shines a really great light on understanding the entrepreneurial process and being in that first column, in that discovery phase of any, of building a business. So we'll talk about that opportunity discovery phase that happens in that column, in that first column, and ways that you can start to develop that in your organization, sort of get back into that first column and have your people thinking in that way. And then at the end, I'll give you an overview of our Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs and how they've been utilized in a number of ways really around the world. So with tens of thousands of students, multiple thousands of facilitators of our program. So I'll talk to you more in detail about those programs, and then of course take any questions around that as well. All right, so let's dive in to our first concept here around entrepreneurial learning. So it is the name of our company, the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. So we look at trying to understand how entrepreneurs, in this instance that we're talking about, we're really trying to understand how those who have started with next to nothing and been able to build it into something for their communities, how they were able to learn along the way. And many times you'll find that they don't learn in a very traditional fashion. Of course, they're picking up skills that they need along the way. They're picking those up in traditional schooling methodologies, but entrepreneurial learning tends to be much more open than those sort of closed systems that we see in a traditional educational environment. And so, we'd like to talk about this idea that Peter Gray brings up in his book, Free to Learn, which is that, humans have the capability, we have the innate capability and desire to learn everything that can make us thrive in our environment and be able to adapt to our situation. However, many times we're not able to meet that full potential. And that's where the systemic issues come into play of being able, cutting off that capability to really for each individual to meet their full potential. And I like to talk about this concept in this fashion. When you think of this sort of free to learn methodology, many people point to like a typical Montessori model where students come in, they get to just sort of choose what they're interested in, and they go, and because they have that internal motivation to go and their interest is there, they're going to learn as they go through that process. And it's very similar to that models, and it sort of underpins the general philosophy around it, that it's individually driven based on your interests. Well, the reality of the situation is, and that's great in theory, right? So that works well in theory, but now let's place it into our society of today, where we have very well-defined systems of education, and we also have very well-defined systems of work. And in general, those are tied tightly together. So you start off in school and you understand, like, you got to get through, in the US, you got to get through high school and then, potentially move on. Sometimes that's all the schooling you're going to get. But after that, you're going to potentially move into higher education, get certain certifications, certain skills, or an advanced degree, et cetera, with the assumption that just by stepping through that process, you're going to learn everything that you need to know to be successful. And I think we understand that neither of these models really meets the needs of today. We can't fall completely on the idea of schooling in a traditional sense, where it really is modeled on an industrial model. Everybody comes to the class at the same time, the bell rings, you move between classes, you're tested, you rote step through the process. We know that the world is changing, and Gary hit a lot on that yesterday about the changes going on in our world. And COVID is a perfect example of this VUCA environment, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that is becoming more and more natural or becoming more and more prevalent in our world. So we know that traditional model isn't perfectly designed. It's not doing well in helping build entrepreneurs. We're essentially creating them by accident, because they're not able to thrive in that very heavily bounded situation, because entrepreneurs tend to want to operate and do operate in this more open and free to learn type environment. So the problem we have as far as applying these ideas and therefore creating more entrepreneurial mindset in anyone that we're working with is we're bound by the systems that are in place today, be that our educational systems, our structural systems within our corporate or government environments. And so the question is, how can we thread that needle? How can we work within that structure, but still bring in these concepts to help change and innovate and eventually bring those systems to where we get a more balanced approach. And essentially what we need is this entrepreneurial mindset, as well as the opportunity or the ability to work in a system as it's designed. So we want to train people to do both. Okay, that's the majority of my philosophy behind this today. Now let's start digging into really the details behind what does it mean to be, when we talk about entrepreneurial learning, because ultimately what we're trying to do is move anyone from that amotivated state where they can find themselves, if they're just not interested in what's going on, they don't even want to get off the couch, right? How do we get them further down this pipeline to where they're, the holy grail is that intrinsic motivation, where they're interested in exactly what they're doing on a daily basis. They have a high interest in it, and it motivates them and brings them forward. We know that our systems, as they're set up, be they in education, government, and corporate environment, are heavily based on intrinsic motivation these days, either for money or promotion or having the big house or whatever that is. It's generally an extrinsic motivation. So we want to integrate these ideas behind the entrepreneurial mindset so that we can move people up that scale to get them closer and closer to finding that area of intrinsic motivation that can really motivate them to go forward and do great things. And that can happen in that first column. And that's where someone in, a entrepreneurial learning environment finds themselves in this situation where, like I mentioned, things are highly ambiguous and they don't have many resources, that's actually the perfect environment for these skills, these entrepreneurial skills, to be developed. The problem finding skills of empathy, curiosity, observation, and inquiry. And then once they have that problem found, solving that problem through creativity, critical thinking, communication, resourcefulness. Anybody would notice that it works in education, that these are the 21st century skills that everyone in the education world is talking about as students are going to need to survive and thrive in this century. And then we also drive towards, when you're operating in this first column of discovery, we drive toward this ideas of self-direction and self-regulation when it comes to learning. And every educator knows that if you can get a student who is self-directed, you pretty much just have to get out of their way. So that's what we're looking to get people to through these processes. All right. So the first concept behind entrepreneurial learning is that it's very experiential, and it's based on those life experiences where it can be reflected upon, attitudes and new methodologies changed, and then moved in, and more experience happens. And we'll talk a little bit about that cycle here in a second. Entrepreneurial learning is very project-based. It's, if you think about a typical entrepreneur that's trying to bring their idea out into the world, they have a vision of something that they want to bring forward, but they have no idea how to get there. And they don't even really know the ground rules or how they can sometimes even get started. So it's very, very ambiguous. So they have this project in mind of something they want to do, but they're not really sure how to start. And many times, and the best way that someone can move forward is through having some collaboration, having some mentorship. So we'll talk about some ideas around project-based learning and trying to develop opportunities for those that you're trying to make more entrepreneurially minded, have them focus on projects as they're doing that. Peer-to-peer learning is something that also entrepreneurs do naturally, right? Because they don't have a traditional path of education to follow, they're talking to folks in their community who have maybe done something similar before, or they're having a conversation with people just out at the local coffee shop. They're trying to learn all the time from their peers. They're not looking to an authority or a degree as a way of achieving the level of knowledge that they need to know. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then ultimately we find that entrepreneurs are self-directed learners. And so when we look back at that, that scale I had around motivation, that's why they're so self-directed, is because they're much further down that scale when it comes to motivation. They're in that intrinsic motivation realm. So they're driving their idea forward and learning things along the way, and not doing it for the degree or for the GPA or just to say that they've been to school. They don't care about that. They're looking at driving their idea forward. So we'll talk about some ideas around self-directed learning as well. All right, so when we talk about experiential learning, we rely on the work of David Kolb, who in the 70s and 80s did a lot of work to understand how learning truly happens. And I think if we think about it, even if you're doing something as simple as reading a book, you have that experience, right? But until you have an opportunity to reflect on what you just read, which in our traditional education system might be writing a paper about that and thinking about it, right? And then getting that feedback to where you can understand how to make your expand upon your idea or other ideas that you received from that initial reading of the book, then go back and look at that book again. That's how this cycle continues. And normally it's applied to sort of traditional experience. So for instance, when I was learning to fly airplanes many years ago, I had a concrete experience. I would just be up in the air learning to fly the airplane. I might have an instructor with me, and I would following the flight get that idea of sort of reflecting upon, okay, what did I do wrong today? What can I do better the next time? And then as I move through that sort of observation and conceptualization areas, then the next time I was up, going up to fly, I could apply some of those things that I had thought about and said, you know what, I'm going to do that the next time and see if that works out better. So it's very much, experiential learning is very much a trial and error process. And so in a lot of ways, it follows the scientific method. And we find that when someone goes through this experiential learning process, they tend to retain that material a lot better. So as far as applying it within any type of educational setting, it's really important that you give people the time, if they have an experience, that you give them the time to reflect upon that experience, to come up with a way that they maybe could make that experience better the next time, and then experiment with that. My wife's a science teacher. She can naturally do that in a science classroom where they work through experiments, in an iterative fashion and do that a few times. But we all aren't able to do that on a daily basis. But if we can apply that type of thinking in our work, or in our schools, if you're in education, then you can start to build some of these entrepreneurial skills that we're looking to build. The next concept that we like to talk about around how entrepreneurs learn is in a project-based fashion. So you heard me talk before about the idea that they have this compelling goal. If you heard yesterday, Gary, talked about the compelling goal that drives entrepreneurs forward toward that vision of the future that they have. And so with a project-based process, that's the idea behind the student-centered nature of it. It shouldn't be, as much as possible, it shouldn't be an outside force saying, hey, you go take a look at solving this particular problem, because then there's no ownership involved there. As much as possible, you should be looking for, hey, what problems do you see? So, in a student environment, having them come up with problems that they see in the world, problems that they see in their classroom, problems that they see at work, whatever the case may be, having them come up with those problems on their own, and then starting to act on those and solve those, you're going to get the most motivation when that's the case. Pushing, a teacher or a manager, someone, coming in and saying, I need you to solve this problem. Okay, they might get it done, they might not. They might put all their effort into it, but it's not as motivational as if they've chosen the problem that they're working on themselves. So the trick from a leadership or from a teacher perspective is to allow them that space to develop those problems, but then guide and facilitate them through the process so that they don't go too far off the rails as they're trying to solve that problem. With project-based learning, it should occur in small groups. You start getting, 5, 6, 7, 8 people in a group, and then it becomes death by committee, right? Like everybody, just starts throwing up naysaying, it becomes this more of air of grievances rather than like a small group can say, okay, it's on the 3 of us here. Let's see if we can get this figured out. And everyone can participate and play an active role and not feel like they're being left on the wayside and then throwing darts at what everybody else is doing. So usually this should be done in small groups. Anyone who's guiding this type of learning should be a facilitator. You heard me use that word before, meaning that they're not directing what's going on. They're just helping guide. They're asking a lot of great questions. They're not the ones telling others what to do. So in a traditional environment, it's not through lecture, through like a K through 12 traditional lecture. You're just, whatever questions come up, you may help them guide or help point them to some resources, but you're not answering the questions for them. That learning happens and that entrepreneurial mindset is formed by the act of them going on their own and determining and figuring it out. Problems should always be introduced early into the learning process. Don't wait until the very end and sort of lecture and talk about everything, and then now we're going to work on the problems. Let them get started on the problems right away, because that experiential part of the program or anything that you're doing is what brings that motivation to the fore. We talked about the problem solving skills that come out of this process. So those problems help develop those skills as they go. And then of course, new knowledge is obtained. As they're going through and coming across barriers that they've had to cross to solve their problem, they're learning things as they go along the way. The other aspect associated with these problems is that they should be ill-structured. So there's, probably no 100% right answer. It's not like, I used to teach math. It's not, a traditional math problem, you get the 100% right answer. It's, there's some range of answer that looks like it solves the problem. It should be open-ended and complex, which is like most of the problems that we see in our world today. And that's, mirroring the real world. We talked about the collaborative nature, that it evolves as you get new information and learn new items. And it should spark interest and controversy. And we have no shortage of that today, right? There's plenty of controversy to be had, but when that can be focused on solving the problem, you can really move forward quickly if it gets people involved and if they're passionate about it. And then ultimately, by the end, it should spark new questions. There should be new areas to go and pursue afterwards that either the same group or another group can go and pursue. I talked about the importance of peer-to-peer learning when it comes to entrepreneurial learning. And for this, we refer to the work of Drs. Lazary, Mazur, and Watkins, who have done a lot of work back in the late 2000s around peer-to-peer learning. And what they looked at, they specifically did some work at Harvard University, and they also did it, I can't remember the name, but it's essentially a technical college in Canada. So two different types of higher education, talking about how they had classes both at Harvard and at their technical college that they were finding that many students were dropping. They were required courses, but a lot of students were dropping. And so the question was like, okay, can we engage and keep these students involved in this class if we try and teach them with a more peer-to-peer process? And what they found was it was a huge difference between the classes that were taught peer-to-peer, where the teachers acted, or the professors acted as facilitators of the learning process through those classes, rather than sort of a traditional lecture-based process. And we loved this quote from that paper that talks about the knowledge retention that's gained by turning those passive note-taking students into active de facto teachers who can explain their ideas to each other. I think anyone who's been in education or any type of situation where you've had to instruct others, you learn it better as you go to teach it than you ever did when you learned it the first time. So if you can set up an environment where there is opportunity for peer-to-peer learning, to let those students or whoever it is you're working with, to give them that time and space to have those conversations, to learn from each other, you're going to find much more motivation and moving down that scale towards that intrinsic motivation and results as well. And then finally, I want to talk in this section, I want to talk about the work of Gerald Groh and this concept of moving down, helping students moving down the pipeline from being dependent learners, which I think many would agree that in the education space today that, students struggle to move down this scale from where they're just looking to, okay, what do I have to do to get the A? What exactly do I have to put on this test in order to pass and to get my grade at the end, right? So they're very dependent on someone else telling them what to do and what to learn. And so it's our roles as educators in whatever situation that is, school, corporate government, wherever we're at, is to help sort of piece by piece move them down this pipeline to where you're using some of these other techniques that I've talked about with, using the peer-to-peer learning, with giving them experiential problem-based opportunities that can get them more interested and involved as they move and start exploring those problems that they're interested in, to the point where they can become self-directed learners and you pretty much can just back up and guide it. my background comes from teaching leadership, and there's so much parallel here between how leaders operate versus what would be sort of traditional management, right? So in an educational system, generally educators are managers. They're lecturing, they're, giving a well worn path of how to succeed, right? Whereas what we're talking about now is the difference in developing these entrepreneurial mindsets. It's much more of a leadership methodology compared to like a typical management methodology, where you're building these skills within those that you're working with so that they can be leaders within their community because they've developed these skills by going through these processes. Okay, so I've been talking a lot. I need to get a drink of water. It's been about a half hour. I want to close this section with this quote from Peter Gray that I think encapsulates, a lot of this concept. We ultimately want children or whoever we're working with, adults in a work environment, to buy in that they take responsibility for their own education and own growth and own learning. And unfortunately, if we rely too much on that system that I was describing earlier in the webinar, sort of our traditional education system today, we're building too many folks who just feel like it's all figured out for me. I just do exactly what I'm told and everything's going to work out. And we're cutting them short on how to make them successful adults. So we need to develop these entrepreneurial skills in them through these processes that we're talking about. Okay. I'm ready for questions. Let me take a look. If you've got a question, feel free to either put it in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll see if I can answer it or see if Nick has already responded to anything.
Sure. We've got one in the can, and as Rob said, if you have any questions, we'll be taking a few minutes to break here. So please feel free to put those in the Q&A or chat. First question though. If you could give your insights into implementing entrepreneurship mindset in a university setting, knowing that the leadership in a university is more of an academic, which is kind of coming from a different mindset than an entrepreneur, how you can kind of reconcile that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Andy, there, and I want to refer to sort of right what I was closing it out there with about that difference between leadership and management. I think in a traditional, and I've worked at a university setting, I've worked in a community college setting, I've worked high school setting along with my time. Like I said, I was working, building leaders. And what I found in a sort of university or community college environment is you're right. The folks that move up through the ranks in those positions aren't versed in these ideas around sort of entrepreneurial learning and more open-ended thinking. They got their PhD, they're very well versed in maybe a specific field, but the taking an idea and bringing it out into the world and all the experiential nature that happens through that this sort of type of learning we're talking about, not in the traditional learning, they just don't have any experience with doing it. And that's okay, because they need, in those environments, they need those academic credentials to be respected generally, right? Because everyone else that is working, so if you're a university president and you bring in a entrepreneur straight off the street, they're not going to be very respected generally by the rest of the community, because they don't understand the teaching aspects and the research aspects that go into being a professor. So they have to grow their skills. They have those skills on an academic side, but what they need to grow are those leadership skills. And so that's where I recommend, the folks that we're seeing have great results with this are taking these ideas and they're empowering their people. So they may, decide, It's very typical for a university to have a strategic plan for the next 10 years, right? And that's the role of that leadership. Between the president, the VPs, they get together and say, okay, we're going to lay out this strategy. We're trying to understand, how our university can grow and better things we can do for our students. Let's lay that strategy out. And that's great because that is the vision. So if you can have a university leader that lays that vision out there and then is able to coordinate, and it's very important at this point, that they help get everyone to buy into that vision and to see how their personal vision aligns with that overall organizational vision. And that's the first step that has to happen. You have to have that vision for the overall organization. Then you have to, and this is all leadership throughout the organization, has to then work with everybody. And I'm talking, the janitor who's, taking the trash out every evening. Everyone should recognize that their role and their vision is helping move the university forward and helping bring it forward. So that's the first area that like a university president would need to concentrate on, is getting that buy-in as much as possible from everyone in the organization. Then I mentioned this idea of empowerment. So it's one thing to say, okay, we're all moving down the path. We're all moving in this direction. That's great. And I've got the team moving forward, but you're not going to get the most out of people if they're not feeling like they can really contribute to change and to innovation to help make that happen. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about Albuquerque, which is like a government situation. So it's not exactly a university, but very similar results when you can empower people to search out problems and solve them on their own without having to come up the chain and get, approval, 5 different levels of approval. You're going to open that up to where individuals will feel much more engaged in their work, and they'll be able to use this type of methodology with learning and driving the organization forward. Okay.
Absolutely.
Answer there.
So we have another question that I'll ask, but if you want to kind of start the answer and perhaps bring it up as we go, I think this is a good kind of overarching question.
Sure.
How can we strike a good balance between students who prefer the traditional method of lecturing, passive learning,
Yep,
versus those who prefer experiential project-based learning?
Yeah, it's interesting. I get into this conversation with my wife. I mentioned she's a biology teacher, and she is a very traditional educator, and the students love her in general, right? So because I think, I'm going to use her as an example, she might not appreciate this. I think she does a great job of providing enough opportunity. It's a balance, right? So you're going to have, in a traditional setting, let's say you have 24, 30 students in a classroom. There's going to be, if you think of it on a bell curve, there's going to be some that just really are dedicated to their academics, and they're going to check all those boxes and do everything that they have to. They're going to follow the rules. They fit really well into that traditional educational structure. So they love that very teacher directed, take the notes, here's the test, because they can thrive in that environment. Okay. They tend to fall, in that lower end of the tail there on that bell curve. Then I think, this is my experience, from being in the classroom, I think the vast majority of students, they do appreciate that opportunity to do this type of experiential learning and peer-to-peer learning, recognizing that within our system, they're still concerned that the grade's going to be okay, that they're still going to check all the boxes that they need to do to move forward. And so I think in her case, what my wife does is she does a good amount of that lecturing and sort of traditional note-taking, but she also intermixes it with a good number of project-based opportunities for the students to work together. And then those students who aren't as comfortable in those environments can get, that's the ones who are the note-taking and all that. They can get some opportunity to experience that. And then the ones that learn best in that environment, it really provides them an opportunity to do so. So I think it is a balance. I think you have to find ways to integrate both types into your pedagogy and make that just sort of the natural methodology. I think the problems come when you do all of one or all of the other, because you're gonna lose one set of students. So if you're able to integrate both, then you should be able to keep the vast majority of them engaged. And then there's the far end of the tail down there where, they're on that more A-motivated scale. They've probably got other issues going on, other things that are just distracting them so much from their education that it's very difficult for them to be involved no matter what the case may be. And you have to do your best to bring them along, but sometimes they need that extra support. So, okay, hopefully that answered that question. All right, so we're approaching like about halfway through the webinar. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on with the next portion here. As you have questions, please just keep submitting them as you have, and we'll address those as we go. All right, so now let's get to a little bit more detail on 8 core competencies that you can try and build in to your systems of education, however you're doing that, whichever group you're working with, concepts that you can try and build in there. And we're taking this from the lessons that we were able to glean. These are lessons that were gleaned from interviews of hundreds of unlikely entrepreneurs. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the last section. But they're essentially 8 life lessons that anyone can do. So it doesn't require a crazy IQ. It doesn't require any connections. It doesn't require any money. It's things that anyone can start wrapping their head around. And really, they're the essence of the entrepreneurial mindset. So let's talk about these core concepts. The first, and if you look at this sort of as, building blocks here, the baseline of everything is the power to choose. So if someone finds themselves in an educational situation where they just feel like they have zero choice about, what's going to happen day in, day out, of course, their motivation level is going to be in the dumps, right? And so looking for ways that individuals can choose their path forward. And, I think about in a sort of traditional K through 12 environment, really great student counselors, when they're not overburdened. I mean, I know that most counselors, I know my daughter's school, like 300 kids, they had to oversee. But the ones that are really good can really help tap in to this need to really help students underline their vision for the future so that they can start making choices to move towards that vision. So this first core competency is based around that idea of setting a vision for yourself and then making choices every day. Everything that you do helps you move towards that vision, and helping people realize that, you can complain about, this or that, and, worry about things that are outside of your control, but essentially focusing on what you can control and what you can change and what you can choose to do, rather than looking at Candy Crush on your phone for 10 minutes, maybe go look at a course and learn that accounting that you've been, putting off to the wayside right now. So everyone is making those types of choices on a daily basis. And so we really try and highlight that as sort of the baseline for moving forward with an entrepreneurial mindset. The next concept, and this is, something that I'm hearing more and more just out in the world these days, is turning problems into opportunities, right? This is how entrepreneurs look at the world. When they see a problem, they don't get demotivated to the point of, wow, that problem is horrible and we'll never get past that problem. They look at it as, okay, yep, it's a problem and it might be a big problem. But you know what? There's now opportunities and for us to fix that problem. And that potentially, me as an entrepreneur, I can make some efforts to start moving towards fixing that problem. So it's really, looking at problems in that way. And the more you go through this process and the more you're able to build these entrepreneurial skills, you're not as distracted by the thought of, oh, geez, here's another problem. It always rains on my parade. Here we are again. Here's another problem. It's okay. There's another problem. Let's see how we can move forward in fixing that. And in moving forward, it gets us to our next concept here, our sort of next competency of this entrepreneurial mindset is that they don't sort of overanalyze that issue. They just start taking some little actions. We call it micro experimentation to just start whittling away at that problem so that they can, take that initial problem that they've identified during that recognizing opportunities, portion there where they're going, okay, here's a problem I want to solve. And they start taking action toward that. And what's critical in this section is to understand the barriers. So you as a facilitator trying to guide someone and help them get past and develop this more entrepreneurial mindset, this is where most people stop because they can have a vision for the future. They can say, yep, here's the problem I want to solve. I want to get involved with this. And then boom, the real world hits, right? So there's all kinds of barriers that everyone faces, right? Whether that's financial, psychological, friends, connections, fear. We always talk a lot about fear. Most people, are afraid to get out of their comfort zone. And some of these things that we're talking about force people out of their comfort zones, right? So it's your role as you're trying to make someone more entrepreneurial to help them get past those barriers, not by, taking care of it for them, but by helping guide them through that and essentially being a partner as they move and get beyond their fears. And what happens during this process is they've recognized an opportunity or a problem that they want to solve. They start micro experimenting with it and they come across some barriers and they have to get it figured out and they start getting a little bit of traction and they start recognizing, and this is where it really applies in an educational setting, wow, there's things I'm going to need to learn in order to solve this problem. But now they're more naturally motivated to go learn those things. For instance, if I've got a student who is really just enamored with hummingbirds and they want to build an app that helps describe the nature of hummingbirds and helps people track hummingbirds around the country or something like that, that might be their issue they're trying to solve. They start taking some action and they go, oh, wow, I'm going to need to learn how to program in this certain language, or I'm going to need to research how hummingbirds thrive in the wild. Now they have some direction about what they want to go learn. And because they're really interested in the problem that they're trying to solve, now those barriers when it comes to the education don't seem quite as high because they're motivated to get beyond that. So this creates a sort of virtuous cycle where the problem, as it's being understood and turned into an opportunity, actions are being taken, new knowledge is being gained. As new knowledge is gained, there's more understanding of the problem and opportunity, and you can move forward with finding a solution to that problem. And what we find through these sort of first four stages or competencies is that what starts happening are these next four, right? So we categorize this as creating wealth. This is how it was originally categorized in our original programs. But what it's really all about is resourcefulness and well-being. If you think of wealth as well-being, then it's right where we want you to be, because it's thinking about the resources that are available that you may have never even considered before. How many of us have connections, be they parents, grandparents, uncles, friends that live down the streets, parents of friends, whoever it is, that maybe has some great knowledge and experience that we can learn from, but we've never reached out and utilized that resource before. And so it really causes people to take stock of what they have, no matter how little that is, and see how they can start building upon that and moving towards their vision. The next item, sort of the sixth concept we talk about, is this idea of building brand. And that's, sort of a very business oriented vernacular, but really what it's all about is reliability. When someone has a very strong brand, they're reliable. And when you're trying to solve a problem for other people, which if you heard the discussion with Gary yesterday, that's the essence of what the entrepreneurial mindset. It's all about solving problems for other people and therefore empowering yourself. When you're doing that process, other people start relying on you. So you have to be reliable in order to continue to move forward. And what this eventually creates is a real sense of community where I'm relying on you to solve this problem for me, and you're relying on this other person over there. We really create our own economy of being able to help each other out. And so that's this idea around the community that's created. There's this idea of mentorship. There's, creating an intentional community, not just falling into folks that maybe aren't helping you drive your idea forward. And then finally, everyone knows who's worked in this field, persistence is tough. And learning to persist, no matter what barrier is put in your way, doesn't come very easily. And it's only through this process, this continued iterative process of building this mindset of being able to succeed and move past whatever barriers are there, that prevent folks from sort of hitting that first barrier and failing and then giving up and never wanting to go that way again. And we see this in education over and over and over. I mentioned I was a math teacher. Very common for students to come in, throw the pencil down after the first problem. I don't get this. I don't understand this. There's no concept of persisting and fighting it out, getting past it. And that goes to like the motivation and why are they doing this in the first place that we talked about previously. So if you can make that connection, work them through this process, you will see more persistence. They will persist and move beyond those barriers that they're seeing. All right, so we're at our next stopping point. Based on these 8 core competencies or anything that we've talked about today, are there any questions out there I can answer?
Nothing's come in yet, but just like last time, we'll give you all a minute or two to get your questions in.
Yeah,
one point I wanted to make, just to back up that section Rob was just talking about, is the importance of the mindset can't necessarily be adopted before you start practicing the things. It's similar to building or breaking a habit. You have to work towards that goal, whether that's the compelling goal that Gary was talking about yesterday, or something a little smaller, a compelling goal like, oh, I want to stop biting my nails. That's a popular one, popular New Year resolution for a lot of folks. That's going to happen over time and through deliberate practice. What we're talking about here in terms of building an entrepreneurial mindset is the same thing. It's just applying that to a problem that you have found out there in the wild. We've used that term a few times. And then working at it and working with those around you. So applying that to a classroom is very similar. You can't just say the entrepreneurial mindset, it's my job to be as useful to as many people as possible and therefore empower myself and just have it immediately. You have to start practicing it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nick. That's a critical aspect of this, that it's a process, right? This is built up over decades for many people, right? Yeah. And that can be daunting, right? Because, everybody wants a quick solution, but the fact is that it's only by working through this process over and over and over that mindset can be affected, especially if it's been, already put into some other type of situation by the surroundings that they found themselves in at one point. So it's critical that this take place over time. And those last four items I was talking about, you know, the well-being, the reliability, the community, and the persistence, that comes with effort over time, having gone through this process, this iterative process. So really, it's our role as educators to provide as many of these opportunities as possible if we're really serious about creating those 21st century skills in our students.
Absolutely spot on. Okay, two questions just came in. What do you think is a critical aspect of entrepreneurship education that is ripe for future research by academics that will benefit both educators and learners?
Well, I hate to be sort of self-serving here, but I think this idea of mindset is pretty new on the scene. You know, when Gary initially, I'll tell a little bit of what I was going to tell further down, but when Gary initially started his research, Gary Schoniger, our founder, they were looking for areas where there were holes in the entrepreneurship education ecosystem. And what they found was that no one was talking about mindset. No one was talking about how entrepreneurs think. And so that led to our work. Now that's been 11 years ago. And we've seen at many conferences we go to, you see it out in Google a little bit more, like Google alerts and articles and things. More and more people are talking about this term, the entrepreneurial mindset, but really understanding what that is and trying to provide a way to analyze and quantify that is very, very difficult, because with psychology, sociology, these things are hard to put numbers around. So I think it's really ripe for research, and we're actually, you know, we have a number, we have thousands of facilitators, but we have a number who have approached us and are on their own, either as they're working on their PhD or they're doing other research, they're looking into these ideas around the entrepreneurial mindset. So I think specifically looking at ideas around motivation and how it's tied to the entrepreneurial mindset could be a critical area, because motivation is you know, so important for individual success these days. You got to start you know, with that, because too many of our young people are finding themselves not knowing what the future holds for them. And I think, you know, our world is showing that in quite a few ways right now. And so because of that lack of real vision for what the future could be and how they can help bring that to fruition, it comes down to their motivation to do that, combined with this process to where they can build the mindset. So that sort of intersection of motivation and the mindset, I think, would be a critical area for research.
Great. We've got another question here about, have we seen any patterns in between the transitions, that is between the steps, the eight competencies that are the most common stumbling blocks? And immediately what comes to my mind is fear.
Yep, that's what I was going to say, Kathy. That's the most common, because when you know, have a philosophical discussion about, hey, what do you see your world looking like in 5 years? You know, most people engage in that. They will, you know, put some ideas out there. And then you start saying, okay, now let's think about some problems you see in your life or you see in the world. You know, which ones would you like to get involved with solving? And, you know, people will come up with some great ideas. There start to be teams formed. And when you hit that third concept, that sort of third competency of action, that's where many people are stopped in their tracks. And it's because they're having to usually overcome some type of fear that they have of, you know, either, you know, because to do this process, you've got to go talk to a lot of other people. So there's a lot of people, believe it or not, like me, who are introverts, who aren't real comfortable just walking up to someone on the street and starting to talk to them about this problem and, what ideas do you have around it, or placing phone calls, or, you know, um, even just reaching out to people on social media, whatever the case may be. It's generally when they start to take those, or they're required to take those actions, that they start throwing up all the barriers, like, I don't have enough time. And, or I don't have enough money, or I don't have enough of this, or I don't have enough of that, or I'm scared. And that's where we find with our facilitators of our programs that it's really critical to have that mentorship at that point, because you can start to combat some of those barriers and fears. For instance, if they say, "Hey, I don't have enough time," well, but you can help them analyze that and say, "Okay, well, tell me about what you did over the weekend. What was, from 7 a.m. to midnight, what were you doing? 7 hours of sleep is usually good for most people. So what was going on? Give me a rundown." You can start to people will start to recognize, like, yeah, maybe I did have 2 hours there where I could have, taken action on that. And I think that's where the motivation piece comes in. When you are motivated to get something done, you'll find the time, you'll find the energy to get that done. So, but that's usually the biggest stumbling block for folks.
Absolutely. And just one other piece to add there to help your students or folks that you're mentoring along with combating that fear. Another really important piece of the program that Rob's about to talk about, but also just in general, if you're trying to adopt these concepts in your classroom, is practicing journaling or self-authoring. That's a really great way for people to name and identify the feelings they're going through, whether that is a fear or discomfort or whatever, discomfort of the unknown, and help them to actually kind of grapple with the idea, right? And in that way, take ownership of what is yours and what you can control and what is outside of your control. Kind of going back to that locus of control concept Gary was talking about yesterday, and making changes in your life based on what you are able to control and moving past that which you can't.
Exactly. And that ties in that experiential cycle we were talking about. People have feelings having gone through some type of experience. If they're not given that opportunity to reflect upon that and then make changes the next time. So it's also very important that they do that becomes a big part of that.
And Nancy threw in a comment also, by writing it down, you can recognize opportunities and solutions when you come upon them, which is a really great point, Nancy, really great point. You might not even realize it was an opportunity until you literally wrote it down or dictated it in a note, if you prefer that sort of journaling.
And to be honest, it's tough in today's world. It's such a fast pace, and, everyone has to, answer everything in just a short clip. We rarely take that time, or, I think most people rarely take that time to truly reflect. So that's an important aspect here.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we've got just short of a half hour left. So let me keep rolling, because I still have some more ideas here I want to get out to everyone. So let's start talking about the sort of opportunity discovery process, or the nature of opportunity discovery. And, we've mentioned this a few times. Gary alluded to this yesterday in sort of the theory portion of this webinar, that, entrepreneurship is really that self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And it's that self-directed nature which gets them that motivation to keep moving forward, right? And what we find is that when they're operating in that first column that we talked about yesterday, that they are finding these opportunities, and it's a very ambiguous environment. They don't know what tomorrow is going to hold, but they're constantly trying new things and moving forward and learning from that. So how can we understand this nature of opportunity discovery? And someone that does a really good job of describing this is a professor named Sarah Sarasvathy, She is at the University of Virginia at the Darden School of Business, and she's been there for many, many years. And her research has focused on this idea around effectual reasoning, which is the way that entrepreneurs think. It's how she describes the way entrepreneurs think. And many of us, those that, you know, have, well, I'm not going to put any numbers on it, but there's lots of people who have to know everything before they'll take that first step. Like it has to be fully laid out for them, and then they'll go. They'll plan it till their heart's content, and then they'll start pressing, right? And that works really well in certain situations. And, you know, we'll talk about some details behind when that works really well. But what entrepreneurs are more prone to do is that they go in order to know. And that's how she defines effectual reasoning. So her description, a good description that I heard from her describing the difference between these, is that with causal reasoning, you look at, let's say you want to make a meal, and you look at the recipe book and say, okay, I need these particular items. You go out to the store, you buy those items, you follow the recipe exactly as it's laid out, and boom, you have your meal. With effectual reasoning, the idea is you just go in your pantry and go, hey, this looks good. I can use this. I can use this. I can use this. Let's put these three together and see what happens. And oh, by the way, my neighbor might bring something over when they come, and we might add that or have that as a side dish. And in this methodology, they're not focused on the exact solution as it's laid out, like in a recipe, where like in a causal reasoning type situation, I think many people find themselves like, oh, I have to know the exact path to get to exactly where I want to get to. That's a typical causal reasoning way to look at the world. Whereas effectual reasoning is, okay, I'm just going to take what I've got, start working at it, and then we're going to build and develop from there. And I think back to the question I was answering previously about that president at a university and how to build these types of ideas, I think if you can lighten up on the causal reasoning where, okay, we have this exact solution in mind, now let's figure out the process to get there and follow that exact process, but allow for some of this effectual reasoning where people can experiment and move forward and make mistakes and fail occasionally, but then come out with something that's really good that can allow for more of this to develop. And I was mentioning like an area where this really works well. From Gary's discussion yesterday, he talked about this idea of sort of the reinvention phase of any system where, you know, the useful thing is found in that first column. The useful thing is then extracted and put out into the world in large scale. But then at some point, that useful thing isn't as useful anymore, and it needs to be reinvented. Well, causal reasoning can work very well in this situation. And when you go to get your MBA, you learn about how to help make this happen, right? These are large scale ventures. There's a lot of careful planning, a lot of research into all the different angles associated with whatever choice is going to be made. And there's experts all along the way. And in this case, the cost of failure is high and the opportunity is visible. You have a well-defined goal that you can move exactly towards and hopefully get there. But what we're talking about is in this first column, this discovery phase, where it's much more based on exploring what opportunities are out there and what can possibly be brought to the forefront. Now is when this affectional reasoning is very effective. And as we talked about, like the concept of micro experimentation, you're just taking little bites at it. You're not doing, you know, mortgaging your house and putting all your money on one bet. You're just making, you know, small little adjustments. And the opportunity in this case is latent. You don't know what's going to come out. You know, that example I gave of the two recipes, you might come up with the greatest new recipe that becomes the most crazy thing on the Food Network just by playing around with what's in your pantry rather than just following the recipes. So that's how this idea behind opportunity discovery plays in with effectual reasoning. Let me take a quick sip. And how this plays out in an entrepreneurial process is I'm using this example of, what we of Eli have created based on initially the work of the business model canvas. Those of you who are familiar with sort of Alexander Osterwalder's work and the business model canvas, but taking those sort of similar ideas and making it into essentially for everyone to be able to use. And this canvas essentially has these three phases where you're analyzing that problem and you're really in a depth of inquiry about that problem, observing that problem, see if you can start coming with areas that you could potentially build a solution to that problem. You move into the solution phase where you experiment and adapt. And then finally, once you have that solution that you know and you have evidence will work, it's a very evidence-based process, then you can advocate for that solution and get it out into the world and connect with the world. So when we're, doing and recommending our entrepreneurial mindset programs to educators out in the world, we recommend that they use this opportunity discovery canvas. It's a very basic canvas. I'll talk about our training in a little bit, but at our training, you learn about the depths of this canvas and how it can be used to take students and guide them through this experiential part of the program. And as students, go through that canvas process, they're getting outside. We call it the sort of out of the building homework, which is a little bit harder these days based on the global pandemic. However, still, possibilities to do this. But essentially, the idea is connecting with stakeholders, interviewing people, discussing the problem with them, asking them good questions, modifying the canvas. It's very much the scientific method of putting a hypothesis out there, then testing that hypothesis, coming back, changing your model, trying it again until you eventually end up with something that will work. We're at one more stopping point before I get to sort of the last phase of our program. I see we had a question pop up. Is there anything, Nick, that?
Yeah, good, good, potentially quick question. STEM in today's professional practice, is it causal? Going back to the Sarah Sarasvathy piece, which, by the way, if folks didn't notice, I added her kind of profile page from the University of Virginia website in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we've been driven more to a causal, and I'm going to talk specifically U.S. K through 12 education right now. We've been driven more to a causal sort of methodology, even in our STEM programs, which should allow themselves for more effectual type processes. We've been driven to that by the testing regimen. That was the unintended consequences initially of No Child Left Behind, where now, for instance, I'm here in Virginia. We have standards of learning courses that every student has to complete, something like 3 math, 4 English, 1 or 2 social studies. And there's a, end of semester or end of year test in those classes. Say take Algebra 2 was one of the ones that I taught. And in those classes, it becomes very much a methodology of follow the path, take the test exactly like we're telling you how to test it, or how to take it, and not worried as much about the outcome of learning. It's more about just getting to that end goal of passing the SOL test. So when we're doing that in our STEM type classes, in math and science, we're giving short shrift to what should be an opportunity for students to open up and allow for more effectual learning. And I think that that's I do think it's an unintended consequence of that choice to go to, that we did 15 years ago or so. And because of that, we have less opportunity than we should in those types of programs. And where I've seen STEM programs be successful is they have all kinds of outside of school activities that allow for that more effectual reasoning. but unfortunately, I think the current structure has, driven it to a much more causal type situation. Okay, anything else?
That is all that we have so far. We're going to take more questions at the end. So if you have anything related to what Rob just went over or anything previously, feel free to throw those in the chat as well.
Okay. All right, so let's move into the last portion of the webinar here. I'm going to talk about specifically about our Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs. Now, we've talked about sort of, you got the theory yesterday if you listened to Gary's webinar, or hopefully if you didn't, you'll watch it later on. Up until this point, I've tried to give you lots of sort of the underpinnings and ideas of things that you can do hopefully after today, and go and utilize those in your classroom or in your workspace, on your own. Try to build an environment that's more conducive to these ideas. If you're interested in, having a more defined program that can help, get this entrepreneurial learning more embedded in whatever it is that you're doing, that's where our Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs can potentially help you out. So let me tell you a quick story about the man you see here on the screen now, Cleve Mormon. So, Gary, when he founded Eli back now about 2007, he started with the support of the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute. And I mentioned they were looking for gaps in the entrepreneurial education system. And they determined that mindset was what they needed to figure out. So he went around the country and into Canada and interviewed dozens of unlikely entrepreneurs, folks who nobody's ever heard of, but had amazing stories to tell. And in coming, one of those interviews, he ran across a gentleman named Clifton Talbert in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Clifton was a successful entrepreneur who was one of the founders of Stairmaster. He had lectured the Supreme Court. He had been the president of a bank. He had written another book titled Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored, and that was nominated for the Pulitzer. So I had this amazing life story. But Clifton was born in southern Mississippi, in the Delta of Mississippi, prior to the Civil Rights Movement. And so Clifton tells the story as Gary starts talking to him about, who taught him to think like an entrepreneur. And Clifton pulled this picture out of a shoebox in his office and described to Gary how at 13 years old, he was able to work with his Uncle Cleve, who only had a 6th grade education, but taught Clifton essentially what he would say is everything he needed to know to be successful for the rest of his life. And that led to Gary and Clifton co-writing Who Owns the Ice House? 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. And those 8 competencies that I talked about are how this book is designed. And that's based on all of these interviews that Gary had completed, and sort of the things that were common and replicable that anyone could do, and that were common amongst these entrepreneurs that Gary was interviewing. And so Clifton tells his story, essentially his life story and everything he learned from his Uncle Cleve at the Ice House in half of the book. The other half of the book is dedicated to Gary describing the 8 lessons that were seen through all of these interviews. So this book has been, when it was first published around 2011, now, has sold, I think we're over 50, 60,000 copies that we know of out into the world. And, tens of thousands of students are experiencing this in some form or fashion each year. And a lot of that has to do with the initial support of the Kauffman Foundation, which you're familiar with them. They're very big in the entrepreneurship space. They caught wind of this work that Gary and Clifton were doing around the mindset, and they helped develop the original Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. And this was courseware that was developed specifically to teach students about these ideas that we talk about in the book and that I've talked about previously today. And so now, we're 9 years down the road. We have 4 versions of the program. We have an original edition, and I'll talk about how that's been used some. We have a student success version, which is used in many ways. It's been used very successfully, community college, university settings, and K through 12 settings. We have a small business version that's for folks who are already in small business. And then we have a middle school edition. That's our newest program. It was actually co-developed with a middle school teacher in Erie, Pennsylvania, who's a facilitator of our programs and has done the Ice House program with his students now for a number of years. Actually, Erie Public Schools has done it with all their students, but Dave specifically helped us develop and flesh out the curriculum here. And there's actually about 600 pages that make up all the background in the middle school edition of worksheets for the kids to use, exercises, etc. So it's very, very in-depth. The course objectives fall across all 4 of those programs. And essentially, it's redefining entrepreneurship so that it's useful for anyone, no matter in what walk of life they find themselves. And that piece, I think, was covered very well by Gary yesterday. It takes real world examples to motivate and connect with students. They need that socially relatable model. They need to see someone that looks like them, that comes from a similar background, that looks and that they can look at and say, you know what, I can move forward because that person was able to do it. So it's embedded with these real world examples. It engages them in the entrepreneurial process. I talked about the opportunity discovery canvas that forms the baseline of the experiential process for the students. The focus is on the mindset, so it's broadly applicable. It's not just designed for someone to start a business. That's a great outcome if it happens, but if it doesn't, no concern whatsoever. We just want these to be learned as life skills so that people can be successful in whatever it is that they do. The course looks to connect the classroom and community, to bring in outside entrepreneurs to be able to provide their thoughts and tell their stories, provide that local model that the students can look up to. And it also helps connect with mentors. It's a facilitated delivery process. So one of the problems of scaling entrepreneurship programs is there's only so many entrepreneurs to go around and they're busy entrepreneuring, right? So they don't have the time necessarily to teach everyone else about how to do this. So in order to scale and get these ideas out into the world, anyone should be able to do this. And actually some of our most successful facilitators have been folks that are philosophy professors or political science professors or middle school teachers. The program relies on the concepts that Albert Bandura talks about when he talks about sort of the critical nature of self-efficacy for people to move forward in their world. And so this concept of guided mastery. There's, always trying to get folks to have those small wins and looking for those relatable social models, as I was referring to, that they can relate to. And then ultimately having that mentorship along the way to help guide them to the finish line. Ultimately getting them to a point to where they're self-aware and they have some self-efficacy and agency to conquer whatever structure they see themselves having issues with. Now, moving to the components of the program, the way the program works is there is 8 core concepts. I talked about the core competencies there. So the program is structured around those core concepts. The students are immersed in those real world experiences by starting on those problems early. They're very early in the program. They develop problems that they'd like to solve and start working towards those. And then they're reinforced with the videos of the Ice House entrepreneurs. And these Ice House entrepreneurs are some of the interviews that were done when Gary did that research, along with others that have been done over the years. They essentially form the case studies that are telling the students, this is my real life story of how this particular concept resonated with me in my life. So it's a great way for them to connect with others that look like them and maybe have similar stories. And we have, folks like Dawn Halfaker, who, is a veteran who lost her arm in Iraq. Jason Campbell, who, he was a foster child, but through some mentorship and an entrepreneurial experience when he was young, opened up the opportunity for him that he never thought would have been there. Brian Scudamore, the founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK, who started with just a few $100s in a pickup truck in an effort to pay his way through college. Rodney Walker on the bottom left, who had been through like 14 different foster homes, had been abused, parents coming from very difficult circumstances on the south side of Chicago, and how a mentor combined with entrepreneurial experiences was able to get him eventually into Morehouse University for his undergrad, Yale for his master's, Harvard now for his working on his PhD. And other students, folks like Ted and Serena Moore on the bottom right, who started with just a few $100s and now, have about 80 folks working for them with their cleaning company. So these examples are embedded throughout the program to give students that relatable model. Now, the way the program is delivered is they're consuming and they're reading over, watching the videos. They're doing lots of discussions. They're looking for ways to apply it. They share it in that peer-to-peer process we talked about. They reflect, which is very important, as we were discussing. So it really, as a whole, takes them through that full entrepreneurial learning process that I was describing them in the beginning. Just to give you a quick overview of how these look, and then we'll take a few questions. The original program was designed as sort of a chalk talk, where it's sort of like a lecture where the concept is described that you want the students to understand, and then embedded within that video is an entrepreneur like Palwasha Siddiqui, who can describe her experience, and you can see the relationship between the concept that's just being described. So there's about 10 hours of video in this content, combined with all the exercises and discussion questions and assessments that go along with that content. With the student success version, and also with the middle school version, the design is slightly different. It's pretty much a sort of digital textbook where the content is in a PDF form and displayed for the student in this way, sort of that PDF form. And then there's shorter video clips that align with the different concepts. And you essentially swap between a read and watch to be able to watch the video and then go back and read. I'm going to quickly hit where these programs have been used, give you a few examples. I know we're getting close on time here, but you can see here, the programs have been used wide swath. And this was where I think from, our organization's perspective, initially the thinking was, oh, it'll just be used with sort of high school students or maybe some college students that, we've seen how it's just, gone to much further usage, where there's economic development organizations, reentry programs for folks that are coming out of prison, workforce development programs. We just had some great examples of that happening. We're seeing it in libraries. Nancy Kishbaugh, who is on this call, is a librarian. She got involved with the program and is doing some amazing things out in Kansas, and we're working with EBSCO to get it embedded more into the library system and available for more people. I've alluded to our facilitators. If you go to our website, you can actually see an interactive map. I believe it's on our Ice House, or on our facilitator page. And we have now, we're coming up on 2,600 facilitators. So it's an interactive map. You can see where our facilitators are around the world. You can see, across the world, 27 different countries along with the United States. So lots of folks out there who have, went through these problems, and many of them are programs, and many of them are using them. We're not fly by night. We've been, had articles done about us in Huffington Post and NPR and CNN, et cetera. So you can Google and, look for those items. I believe they're also out on our website in our news feed. A few quick examples of how the program's been used. We pulled this quote from one of the middle school students, Erie, Pennsylvania. All 7th grade students are going out or are taking this program. So they're taking the middle school program now. And we'd love this quote from Madison because Erie was very, hit hard by the economic crisis and the loss of industry in the area. And so they've had a lot of the societal problems. And so the kids are really recognizing that if they can use this mindset, they can, help change their community. The program was also used throughout Mexico at all of Tecnológico de Monterrey's prep schools. So they have 37 different campuses throughout Mexico. About 7,500 students took the Ice House Student Success Program. And they did that for 3 or 4 years straight. And they had these types of results. There's a great report that we're happy to send to you about the results from that program, but it was really predicated on them developing those 21st century skills that we've been talking about. Pikes Peak Community College used the Student Success Program and the original program at different points to help with student persistence and keeping them engaged in their education. And it had a 28% increase. So what happened is they took all the students coming in who weren't math or English ready and said, okay, you're going to take this Ice House program. There's about 1,600 students. 800 took our program, 800 took another student success program. And the Ice House program students persisted at an 83% rate, whereas the students who took the other student success program only persisted at a 55% rate. So quite a difference in keeping those students engaged and keeping them moving down the pipeline to get their certificates. We've done a large program throughout West Virginia, all the community colleges there. We've trained people across the state. There's various implementations there, all with the idea of embedding an entrepreneurial mindset across all of those community colleges. City government in Albuquerque, all 6,000 city employees are slated to go through the program. They're up to over 600 at this point. And the facilitator, Tom Darling, talks about what an impact it has made on changing the culture within that city government. Most people think of who are some of the least entrepreneurial people. It's government workers, and I can say that because I worked for the government for 20 some years. But the ability of these ideas to bring a culture of engagement and problem solving into the city government has been amazing. There's a great video out there and great links that we can send you to learn more about that if you're interested. And then finally, our largest initiative right now is the 100,000 mindsets that are trying to be changed through the work of NC IDEA in North Carolina, where we've trained now over 200 facilitators across the state. They're doing programs all across the state. They're using the Ice House program in a variety of different ways. The goal is to turn North Carolina into the most entrepreneurial state in the nation. So if you're interested in learning more, I'll answer some questions here. You can always purchase the book. It's available on Amazon. You can get it directly through our website. That's sort of the least barrier point as far as a cost for entry. You can get it that way. You can enroll directly in our Ice House, our self-paced version of our Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. That costs $99, and you can get directly to that online, and we can follow up with you after the webinar with that link. And then, of course, you're welcome to attend our next online facilitator training, which is taking place in November. That cost is right at $1,000, and happens over a month-long period. We do essentially use these ideas to do a hybrid type presentation where we have 4 live meetings discussing the ideas, and then we have a good amount of video content, discussion content. You work through the opportunity discovery process. You learn how to become facilitators of the program. And then finally, we're always available for those keynotes, workshops, or any other professional development programs your organization may need. All right, so sorry I went a few minutes over there. I'll end with this quote. we want to help more and more people be able to go through this process of learning, unlearning, relearning, and staying positive and motivated as they go through that. Okay. What questions do we have, Nick, that are, I've seen some come in, I haven't been able to answer as I finished up there.
Absolutely. And a couple of the last things you hit on started to answer some of them, so that's great. Quick one from John. What version was used by Albuquerque, I believe he's referencing,
yep.
Through the Ice House training, and what about for ex-felons?
Okay, normally, so for Albuquerque, they've used the original program, and Tom Darling, the facilitator there, he created a process where he had sort of two different processes. One for the end, sort of the for everyone, the line workers, and then one for management. And actually, they focus most on the line workers. They put them through the longest portion of the program. And I think he did it over 4 or 8 weeks. I'm maybe mixing that up, but they would get together and go through, much of the content in the original program. And then for the managers, he had a little bit of a different approach, gave them a quicker overview of the full content, but then said, hey, now you're going to have to get out of their way and let people, come up with answers, come up with solutions. And we've got some example, an ebook that talks about some of the results he's seen, and we've got, plenty others in the years since. So those were both the original programs. For the ex-felons, that was also the original program is the one that's mainly been used. I see Sane's question. What do you think of people who said that only entrepreneurs can mentor entrepreneurs? Thanks. Well, I mean, that's a valid point. And I think it's like anything, right? It's how respected can you be in a community if you haven't like truly lived that experience. I think it's all about what we're talking about, and what we're involved with mostly is that very early stage, trying to get that spark lit for entrepreneurs. And that's where I think anyone can do a really good job with that, as long as they follow these techniques we're talking about. I mean, honestly, that's why this program was developed, so that any educator or really anyone could teach others by using these ideas and at least get the ball rolling for someone. If they're truly going to go down an entrepreneurship path and start their own business and go through all the trials and tribulations, that's where entrepreneurs can form a much better role of mentoring as they get further down that path. But in the beginning stages, which is where this content really aligns, it's perfectly, and we've seen through experience, it can be really successful with anyone providing that type of mentorship.
Absolutely. Sinai also had another quick question. What sort of content material can you get from the class for $100? In US dollars, once you are trained, for $99, we sell licenses for individual student access. That gets you access to the 10 plus hours of video content that Rob was mentioning, as well as a fully built out course shell that can be integrated into most major learning management systems. If you're working in a small business development center or economic development programming, there's other ways we can work with you. We have our own LMS or learning management system that you can use with, again, all of that content built out for $100 per person. We also have a range of other types of products that you can work with. As Rob mentioned, the book has been used for folks who are doing this kind of in an ad hoc way, or maybe who are just mostly interested in those 8 life lessons without the deeper dive into the programmatic materials that we've built out. That's absolutely fine. We encourage folks to use that as well.
Absolutely. It's really our goal to have a whole suite of options for, everything from free content like we're doing with this, to just give you some ideas that maybe you can work with, to, to the training, which is more of an investment, to workshops, everything on down the line. So, and the student content. So we really hope to, serve whatever your needs are. I see a lot of comments in the chat. so Nancy, thanks so much. I mean, everything that you've been able to feedback to us after your experience has just been amazing. So if everybody's still on the webinar, if you haven't read Nancy's comments in the chat, please do so.
Some of those she sent just to us, but really.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't pick up on that. Okay. Yeah.
Really good insights into some potential areas for growth for us, incorporating more folks who are, you may have heard the phrase entrepreneurial as opposed to traditional entrepreneurs. I think those are some great insights, Nancy, but also great to hear that she says, I found the Ice House program to be life-changing for me and for our thinking at the library. So just another example of applying these concepts to those who may not be starting a business but still having a real impact on changing the way we think and becoming more innovative and entrepreneurial.
Absolutely.
Also wanted to thank the folks from overseas who are joining us either early in the morning or late at night. That's really great to see some folks joining us there. And Trina Hall from Concordia.
So,
great to
yeah.
have some Concordia representation on the call as well.
You have to tell Bree and the rest of the team out there at Concordia that we said hi. We were lucky enough to do a workshop with the leadership there and really enjoyed that time there. So thanks, Trina, for spending time with us.
Absolutely.
And Absalon, I see your note about South Africa. We've done work with the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation there. Gary's actually gone and spoke at some conferences there, and we have a number of contacts. Margie Worthington Smith, who's working to get these ideas embedded into the K through 12 system across South Africa. So please, yeah, reach out and we'll see how we can help connect.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if there's any questions that we missed or feel that you would like us to expand upon, please feel free to respond to the follow-up email once that goes out later today or early tomorrow. And as always, you can reach us via email or on the phone.
Yeah, and the causal part of my nature makes me always want to hit like exactly 2:30 and be done. So I apologize for going a little bit long today, but I really appreciate the time we spent with everyone, and thanks for your questions. And just let us know if we can help you moving forward. So have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.